Once worshipped on silver screens and concert stages, these stars embodied fame, freedom, and rebellion. Their names once drew crowds. Their faces defined an era of glamour and excess. But behind the flashbulbs and applause lay secrets, scandals, and choices that would eventually shatter it all. Now, decades later, the same spotlight that crowned them has turned into a cold, fluorescent glare behind bars. From movie icons and chart-topping musicians to cult figures and fallen idols, they rose in glory but fell in disgrace. These are 17 vintage-era celebrities whose fame ended not in applause, but in prison walls. Roy Estrada. Roy Estrada's story is one of talent poisoned by darkness, a cautionary tale of how brilliance can rot behind the walls of a prison cell. Born in 1943, Estrada was a founding member of Frank Zappa's Mothers of Invention and the experimental rock group Little Feat. His bass lines helped shape some of the wildest, most influential sounds of the late 1960s, earning him respect as a musical innovator. But beneath that mystic charm was a side of Estrada that would eventually destroy everything. In 1994, he was convicted of assaulting a child and spent 6 years behind bars. Most thought he'd disappear quietly afterward, a disgraced relic of the rock era, but the darkness returned. In 2012, Estrada was once again convicted, this time for committing lewd acts with a young girl under 14. The details were disturbing, the evidence overwhelming. The same man who once stood under stage lights now faces a lifetime of confinement. Estrada is currently serving a 25 years to life sentence in a California state prison. Once praised for his creative genius, he is now remembered for something far uglier. The irony is brutal. A man who helped invent a sound that symbolized freedom and rebellion is now trapped behind bars, silenced by his own actions. The music lives on, but for Roy Estrada, the applause ended long ago. Bobby Beausoleil. Bobby Beausoleil was once a handsome drifter with a guitar, a camera, and a dangerous curiosity about the limits of freedom. Born in 1947 in California, he drifted through the countercultural haze of the 1960s, chasing music, art, and rebellion. He played briefly with bands like Love and the Orchestra, and even had a role in the underground film Lucifer Rising, directed by occult filmmaker Kenneth Anger. To those who met him, Bobby was magnetic, charming, restless, with the wild aura of a man who didn't believe in rules. But rebellion turned into ruin when he crossed paths with Charles Manson. Drawn to Manson's commune in 1968, Beausoleil became one of his early followers, fascinated by the music, the philosophy, and the promise of something bigger than himself. That illusion shattered in August 1969, when Beausoleil brutally ended the life of Gary Hinman, a musician and Manson associate, over a supposed drug deal gone wrong. The incident, which he carried out with a chilling detachment, would mark the beginning of the Manson family's wave of violence that horrified America. Beausoleil was sentenced to life in prison for first-degree offense. For decades, he has painted, composed music, and even released recordings from behind bars, artistic fragments of the man he once hoped to be. Despite repeated parole hearings, he remains incarcerated in California. Bobby Beausoleil now spends his days confined, trapped in the consequences of his own choices. Charles Tex Watson. Charles Tex Watson was the all-American boy who turned into one of the most infamous killers in history. Born in 1945 in Farmersville, Texas, he grew up tall, polite, and church-going, a high school athlete with a clean-cut smile and a promising future. But like many young dreamers of the late 1960s, Watson was seduced by California's counterculture. He moved to Los Angeles, chasing sunshine and freedom, and instead found Charles Manson. Under Manson's influence, Watson descended into madness. He became Manson's right-hand man, the enforcer, the one who did what others wouldn't. On the night of August 8, 1969, Watson led a group of Manson followers to the home of actress Sharon Tate. There, he committed acts so brutal that even hardened detectives struggled to describe them. Tate, 8 months pregnant, and 4 others tragically lost their lives. Watson's chilling words, that he was the devil and was out to do the devil's business, became a grim echo of Manson's twisted gospel. Watson was convicted of 7 counts of first-degree offense and sentenced to life-ending punishment in 1971. But his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment when California briefly abolished the death penalty. Over the decades, he has claimed to have found religion, becoming an ordained minister behind bars. Still, every parole bid has been denied, the crime simply too horrific to forgive. Today, Charles Tex Watson remains in a California prison. Patricia Krenwinkel. Patricia Krenwinkel, born in 1947 in Los Angeles, was a shy Catholic schoolgirl who never quite felt beautiful or wanted. She dreamed of a simple life, marriage, family, maybe a steady job, but fate led her somewhere far darker. In her 20s, she met Charles Manson, a man who promised love, acceptance, and purpose. What began as admiration turned into blind devotion. Under his spell, Krenwinkel transformed from a soft-spoken woman into one of the most loyal members of the Manson family. In August 1969, that loyalty turned deadly. Krenwinkel was one of the followers who stormed into the Los Angeles homes of Sharon Tate and the LaBiancas. She attacked Abigail Folger, the coffee heiress, dozens of times, later admitting she felt nothing. Those words have haunted her ever since. The murders shocked the world and marked the violent end of the 1960s illusion of peace and love. Krenwinkel was sentenced to life-ending punishment, but like the others, her sentence was reduced to life imprisonment when California changed its laws in 1972. Over the years, she's earned college degrees, mentored inmates, and spoken about cult manipulation and remorse, but none of it has been enough to win parole. Now, in her late 70s, Patricia Krenwinkel is the longest incarcerated woman in California's prison system. Bruce M. Davis. Bruce M. Davis was not a typical offender. Soft-spoken, intelligent, and once described as gentle, he was the kind of man no one imagined capable of horror. Born in 1942 in Monroe, Louisiana, Bruce M. Davis grew up in a conservative, working-class environment that emphasized faith, discipline, and education. His early years gave little hint of the path his life would one day take. Curious and introspective, he pursued a degree in theology, driven by a desire to understand spiritual truth and the moral purpose of human existence. But the cultural revolution of the 1960s changed everything. Like many young Americans of that era, Davis became disillusioned with traditional institutions and began searching for something deeper, a sense of belonging and enlightenment that the church and academia couldn't provide. And he found it, tragically, with Charles Manson. Davis became one of Manson's most trusted followers, drawn to his apocalyptic vision and charisma. But devotion to Manson came with a price. In 1969, Davis participated in ending the life of musician Gary Hinman, and later, ranch hand Donald Shorty Shea, whose body was mutilated and buried in the desert. While Manson and others stole headlines for the Tate LaBianca incident, Davis quietly faded into the background until his name resurfaced when the full extent of the Manson family's crimes came to light. In 1972, Bruce Davis was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree offense and sentenced to life in prison. Over the decades, he has earned a master's degree in philosophy and worked as a prison minister, portraying himself as a man of faith and repentance. Yet, despite multiple parole recommendations, California governors have consistently denied his release, citing the brutality of his crimes. Now in his 80s, Davis remains behind bars, a preacher, a philosopher, living his days. Gary Glitter, Paul Gadd. Gary Glitter, born Paul Francis Gadd in 1944, was once one of Britain's biggest glam rock icons, a sequin superstar whose booming anthems like Rock and Roll, Part 2, electrified stadiums and defined the glitter-soaked 1970s. With his silver jumpsuits, wild hair, and swaggering stage presence, Glitter seemed untouchable, a man who could turn every crowd into a frenzy. But behind the sparkle was a darkness that would ultimately destroy his name, his career, and his freedom. In the late 1990s, Glitter's world collapsed when inappropriate content featuring minors was found on his computer. He served time, fled to Southeast Asia after his release, and was later convicted again, this time in Vietnam, for obscene acts with minors. Deported back to the UK, he faced further charges for historic child abuse. In 2015, he was sentenced to 16 years in prison for multiple assaults against underage girls during the height of his fame. He was released in 2023 under strict supervision, but Glitter violated his parole terms and was recalled to prison in 2024. The once glamorous rock star who strutted across stages before thousands now lives under constant watch, stripped of fame, fortune, and dignity. Kid Creole, Nathaniel Glover. Born Nathaniel Glover Jr. in 1960, Kid Creole was once a pioneer of hip-hop, a founding member of the legendary group Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. Back in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when rap was still finding its rhythm, Glover helped build its foundation. Their hits like The Message changed music forever, blending street poetry with social truth. On stage, Kid Creole was sharp, disciplined, and stylish, the kind of performer who believed hip-hop could be art. But decades later, far from the flashing lights of the Bronx, his name resurfaced for something much darker. In 2017, Glover got into an argument with a homeless man, John Jolly, on a Manhattan street. Moments later, Glover attacked him twice with a knife. The man later died of his wounds. Glover claimed he acted in self-defense, believing Jolly was threatening him, but the court saw it differently. In 2022, he was convicted of first-degree manslaughter and sentenced to 16 years in prison. The fall was devastating. Once part of the first rap group ever inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Kid Creole now lives behind bars, far from the culture he helped shape. Harvey Weinstein. Harvey Weinstein was once one of the most powerful men in Hollywood, a producer whose name could make or break careers. Born in 1952 in Queens, New York, he rose from small-time concert promoter to co-founder of Miramax Films, the studio behind some of cinema's most acclaimed works: Pulp Fiction, Shakespeare in Love, Good Will Hunting, and The English Patient. He shaped the Oscars, discovered stars, and cultivated an image of brilliance wrapped in authority. But behind the glamour and gold statues lay decades of secrets, a trail of abuse, intimidation, and silence. In 2017, the illusion shattered. Dozens of women came forward with harrowing accounts of assault and harassment, exposing Weinstein as the epicenter of Hollywood's darkest culture. The revelations ignited the #Me Too movement, changing global conversations about power and accountability. In 2020, Weinstein was convicted of assault on women in New York and sentenced to 23 years in prison. In 2022, he was found guilty again in a separate Los Angeles case and given an additional 16-year sentence. Now, in his 70s and reportedly in poor health, Weinstein serves his time in a New York State prison, appealing but unlikely to ever walk free again. Suge Knight. Suge Knight was the man who turned West Coast hip-hop into a battlefield, powerful, feared, and seemingly untouchable. Born Marion Hugh Knight Jr. in 1965 in Compton, California, he rose from being a promising football player to one of the most intimidating figures in music history. As co-founder of Death Row Records, he helped launch the careers of Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and Tupac Shakur, turning rap into a global cultural revolution. Knight's presence was magnetic yet menacing, the muscle behind the mic, always in control. But his ruthless ambition, violence, and ego eventually consumed the empire he built from nothing. Suge Knight's name became synonymous with violence. From nightclub brawls to alleged connections in Tupac's tragic end, controversy followed him everywhere. The once mighty producer's life spiraled through lawsuits, shootings, and bankruptcy. Then, in 2015, came the act that finally ended his reign. During a confrontation on a film set in Compton, Knight ran over 2 men with his truck, tragically ending the life of one, Terry Carter, and injuring another. Prosecutors called it a serious offense. Knight claimed it was self-defense. In 2018, he pleaded no contest to voluntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 28 years in prison. The man who once commanded the world's most feared record label now spends his days behind bars, stripped of his power, watching the empire he built from the streets crumble without him. Now in his late 50s, Suge Knight is serving time in a California state facility. R. Kelly. R. Kelly's fall from grace is one of the most shocking in music history. Born Robert Sylvester Kelly in 1967 in Chicago, he rose from street corners to superstardom with a voice that defined 1990s R&B. Hits like I Believe I Can Fly, Ignition, Remix, and Bump and Grind made him a global icon, a singer, songwriter whose sound ruled airwaves for decades. Behind the smooth lyrics and seductive persona, though, was a darkness hidden in plain sight. For years, whispers followed him, rumors of underage girls, controlling behavior, and abuse. In 2008, Kelly was acquitted of offenses related to child exploitation charges, but the stories never stopped. Then, in 2019, the truth caught up with him. Following the explosive documentary Surviving R. Kelly, dozens of women came forward detailing horrific abuse. Kelly was arrested, and the world watched as the superstar who once serenaded millions faced his victims in court. In 2021, R. Kelly was convicted of racketeering and trafficking in New York. The next year, he was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison, followed by another 20-year sentence in Chicago. to be served concurrently. Now in his late 50s, Kelly is housed at the Federal Correctional Facility in Butner, North Carolina, far from the stages that once adored him. Clifford Etienne. Clifford Etienne's life is one of the most dramatic transformations in boxing history, a story of triumph, downfall, and tragic twists. Born in 1970 in Louisiana, Etienne grew up in a rough environment but stood out early for his strength and athletic talent. After serving time as a teenager, he made a remarkable comeback, channeling his energy into boxing and earning the nickname the Black Rhino. By the late 1990s, he was one of the sport's most exciting heavyweights, fierce, explosive, and fearless in the ring. Fans admired his heart and hunger, but outside the spotlight, personal struggles and poor decisions slowly unraveled the promise of a great comeback story. Etienne's most famous bout came in 2003 when he faced Mike Tyson. The fight ended in just 49 seconds, marking the fastest knockout in Tyson's career and a turning point in Etienne's own. After that loss, his career began to spiral. Just a year later, his name made headlines again, but not for boxing. He was arrested following a violent incident involving robbery and carjacking, an act that shocked fans who once saw him as a comeback hero. In 2006, Etienne was sentenced to 105 years in prison without parole in Louisiana. Reports say he's been serving his time quietly, painting and staying creative behind bars. Though his story is filled with mistakes, it's also a haunting example of wasted potential. A man who once fought in packed arenas, now fighting for redemption in silence. Today, Clifford Etienne remains in prison, far from the bright lights of the ring. Danny Masterson. Danny Masterson was once known for his charming smile and sharp comedic timing on That 70s Show, where he played Stephen Hyde, the sarcastic, effortlessly cool rebel fans adored. Born in 1976 in Long Island, New York, he began as a child model and actor, appearing in TV commercials before finding steady roles on sitcoms. His breakout in 1998 made him a household name, praised for his dry wit and laid-back charisma. For years, Masterson was considered one of Hollywood's most grounded stars, keeping a low profile and steering clear of the usual fame chaos, until later years when his image took a dark and irreversible turn, with troubling accusations brewing. In 2017, amid the height of the #Me Too movement, several women came forward accusing Masterson of harassment and assault, with some incidents dating back to the early 2000s. The allegations led Netflix to fire him from The Ranch, the series he co-starred in, alongside Ashton Kutcher. Masterson denied all charges, claiming the encounters were consensual, but prosecutors pressed on after years of investigation. In 2023, after 2 trials, Masterson was found guilty of 2 counts of forcible assault and sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. The verdict sent shockwaves through Hollywood, not only because of his fame, but because of the powerful statements made by his survivors in court. Masterson, now serving his sentence in a California state prison, maintains his innocence. Michael Jace. Michael Jace was once a respected and familiar face in Hollywood, admired for his calm intensity and emotional depth. Born in 1962 in Paterson, New Jersey, he carved out a steady acting career across both film and television, appearing in Forrest Gump, Boogie Nights, and Planet of the Apes, 2001. But it was his complex portrayal of Officer Julian Lowe in The Shield that truly defined him. A man of faith and inner turmoil, struggling to reconcile his beliefs with the harsh realities of police work. Jace brought raw honesty to every scene, earning quiet praise for performances that felt deeply human, nuanced, and hauntingly real. Off-screen, he was seen as calm and private, a man dedicated to his family. But in May 2014, a deeply tragic event changed everything. Authorities responded to an emergency call at his Los Angeles home, and it soon became clear that something irreversible had happened between Jace and his wife, April. The details shocked many who knew him, and the industry was left speechless. In the courtroom, testimonies painted a picture of emotional strain and unresolved anger. After 2 years of legal proceedings, the verdict came. Michael Jace was found responsible for the loss of his wife's life and was sentenced to 40 years to life in prison in 2016 and is now serving his sentence in California. Rick Allen. Rick Hardbody Harrison, whose real name is Rick Allen, was once a proud and determined figure in the world of professional wrestling. Born in 1957, Allen rose to recognition in the World Championship Wrestling, WCW, during the 1990s, where his chiseled physique, bold attitude, and undeniable charisma earned him the nickname Hardbody. Though not among the Federation's top-billed stars, he was respected by fans who appreciated the raw power and grit of the WCW era. Before lacing up his boots, Allen served in the U.S. Army, where he developed the discipline, resilience, and strength that later shaped his in-ring persona, a fighter who embodied toughness both inside and outside the squared circle. But away from the spotlight, his life took a darker turn. After retiring from wrestling, Allen struggled to maintain stability. By the mid-2000s, news broke that he was under investigation for serious criminal activity involving human exploitation and unlawful restraint. In 2008, a Georgia court found him guilty of multiple charges related to trafficking. According to federal reports, Allen had manipulated and controlled several women, luring them with promises of modeling and wrestling opportunities. The judge sentenced him to life in prison, a ruling that stunned the wrestling community. Many former colleagues described his downfall as tragic, a man who once inspired young athletes now confined to a cell. Now in his late 60s, Rick Allen remains incarcerated. Ghislaine Maxwell. Ghislaine Maxwell was once a fixture of high society, elegant, educated, and connected to some of the most powerful people in the world. Born in 1961 in France, she was the youngest child of British media tycoon Robert Maxwell, the billionaire owner of the Mirror newspaper empire. Ghislaine grew up in extraordinary privilege, educated at Oxford, fluent in several languages, and known for her poise and charm. In the 1980s and 90s, she became a well-known figure in London and New York social circles, attending charity galas, fashion events, and rubbing shoulders with celebrities and politicians. But her glamorous life began to unravel after her father's mysterious passing in 1991, which uncovered major financial scandals tied to his business empire. Seeking stability and a new beginning, she moved to New York, where she crossed paths with wealthy financier Jeffrey Epstein, a connection that would ultimately reshape and ruin her public image. For years, she remained in his inner circle, surrounded by luxury and secrecy. But as investigations deepened, authorities discovered her involvement in helping Epstein lure and manipulate vulnerable young women. The shocking revelations turned her from a socialite into a global headline. Once seen as elegant and powerful, Ghislaine Maxwell's story became a haunting reminder of privilege, control, and moral collapse. After years of speculation, she was arrested in July 2020 and faced multiple charges related to the trafficking and abuse of minors. The trial, held in 2021, exposed shocking details of manipulation and control within Epstein's circle. Maxwell was found guilty on 5 federal counts, including trafficking, and in 2022, she was sentenced to 20 years in prison and is serving her time at a low-security federal facility in Florida. Joe Exotic. Joe Exotic, born Joseph Allen Schreibvogel in 1963, is one of the most controversial and bizarre pop culture figures of recent years. A man who turned his love for wild animals into a strange blend of fame, chaos, and crime. Long before Netflix made him a household name through Tiger King, Joe was already a local legend in Oklahoma. He ran the Greater Wynwood Exotic Animal Park, where he raised lions, tigers, and other big cats, calling himself the Tiger King. With his bleached mullet, flashy outfits, and country songs about love and revenge, he seemed larger than life, the kind of personality made for reality TV. But behind the eccentric persona was a growing storm. Joe's larger-than-life image clashed head-on with animal rights activist Carol Baskin, who accused him of mistreating his tigers and fought relentlessly to shut down his zoo. What began as a public feud exploded into viral chaos, full of insults, wild online videos, and shocking accusations that fascinated millions. In 2019, Joe was convicted on 17 federal wildlife violations, including the unlawful sale and harm of protected animals, along with 2 counts of conspiracy for plotting against Baskin. Once the flamboyant Tiger King adored by fans, Joe Exotic became a cautionary symbol of fame, obsession, and how ego can turn a wild dream into a downfall. He was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison, later reduced slightly after appeal. Even behind bars, Joe has remained defiant and vocal, giving interviews, releasing statements, and insisting that he was set up. Now in his early 60s, Joe Exotic continues to serve his time in a federal facility, still clinging to fame, still calling himself the Tiger King. Phil Spector. Phil Spector was a genius and a monster of contradictions. Born in 1939 in New York, he rose to fame as one of the most influential record producers in music history. His wall of sound technique transformed pop music in the 1960s, layering instruments and harmonies to create a grand, cinematic sound that shaped hits like Be My Baby by the Ronettes and You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin' by the Righteous Brothers. Artists from the Beatles to Tina Turner worked with him, and his reputation as a perfectionist, even a tyrant in the studio, became part of his legend. But behind the musical genius was a storm few could handle. Phil Spector's brilliance often danced dangerously close to chaos. His perfectionism, controlling nature, and unpredictable temper became infamous among those who worked with him. After dominating the 1960s, he slowly withdrew from public life, becoming increasingly eccentric and reclusive. Then, in 2003, tragedy unfolded at his California mansion when actress Lana Clarkson lost her life during an encounter with him. Though Spector insisted it was an accident, the evidence told a darker story. After 2 trials, Spector was convicted of second-degree murder in 2009 and sentenced to 19 years to life in prison. The verdict stunned the music world. A man who had once defined the sound of love songs now defined tragedy. Even behind bars, his story continued to fascinate and disturb. In January 2021, Spector passed away at the age of 81 while still serving his sentence in a California prison hospital, officially closing one of the darkest and most haunting chapters in music history. And there you have it, a haunting look at fame's forgotten side. These once celebrated stars lit up our screens, sang the songs we loved, and lived lives that seemed larger than life. But behind the glitz and glory were choices and consequences that led them far from the spotlight. It's a reminder that even those who seemed untouchable can fall, and that fame, without balance, can become its own kind of prison. Which of these stories shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this deep dive eye-opening, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, because next time, we're peeling back even more untold truths from the golden age of Hollywood. Thanks for watching.